So I don't necessarily see this as they just moved to the end and they're going to have the base level security be based around Unichain. It's still going to be an Optimism, L2. It's still going to be based on Ethereum, but it moves them out of that messy middle section, and they just will be able to accrue more value, not only in this example, but I think also we now have another use for Uni tokens themselves. And governance is great. I think everybody's always been asking for what's value accrual going to look like. This is one way that they're going to be able to, have value accrual for the Uni token without having to turn on that fee switch.
Hey everyone, this episode is brought to you by Supra, the vertically integrated L1 for super dApps. They have a very cool new product coming out called Supra Containers. So head over to supra.com. That's supra.com/containers. So if you're building on an L1 and it feels a little bit crowded, or the complexity of L2 and L3s are getting you down, just head over to Supra. They'll get you sorted. Thank me later. All right, everyone. This is a message for my DGen listeners out there. If you are getting scalped paying expensive fees to perp dexes, I highly recommend that you check out Index Co-op's new leverage suite. Now, whenever it comes to leverage, do your own research. This is not financial advice. Don't bet more than you can lose, all that good stuff. But if you are going to lever up, you might as well not pay an arm and a leg for it. You can get leverage on BTC and ETH with built-in liquidation perfection, now available on Base, Mainnet, and Arbitrum. So click the link in the bottom of the show notes and head over and check them out today, and you'll hear more from them later in the program.
All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. Before we jump in, quick disclaimer. The views expressed by my co-host today are their personal views, and they do not represent the views of any organization with which the co-hosts are associated with. Nothing in the episode is construed or relied upon as financial, technical, tax, legal, or other advice. You know the deal. Now, let's jump into the episode.
All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. This is live from Permissionless. You got Michael's 1 and 2 here.
And nobody else.
And no one else. In the flesh.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Vance is down for the count with illness.
Yeah.
So hopefully he'll be back next week.
We'll pour one out for him, and also whoever loses this Kane and David fight later tonight.
Yeah, where you think?
I'm gonna back my boy David here. I know he's the underdog, but he's scrappy. He's young, he's fit. He's been training. I'm gonna back my boy here.
I was leaving the conference yesterday at like 5 or whatever, and I walk out, and Kane is walking in because he had some thing that he was gonna go do where he's still wearing his shirt and his training, his shorts and his training shirt, and he has his trainer with him, and he's just like in the zone. I respect your call. I respect your David call, but it's gonna be tough.
I know he's got the height and the reach and everything. Actually, it was on a panel this morning with David and Kane, and we were talking. It was like, how are you two even talking right now? I would just be in my own head about this.
Game day panel is pretty absurd. That's good for them for doing it.
We should have thought about it before, but I also, before we get started, we're obviously recording this from Permissionless. I got to give a shout out to Espresso here. I'm wearing some Carhartt Espresso. Every year we get like one person who nails the swag the most. Bitwise got on the last one. They had some Pro V1s, and this year it's definitely Espresso. So
working man's crypto.
Working man's crypto. Yeah, I just got on my shift in the coal mine and walked right into Permissionless. You know how it is.
With the tag still on.
Yeah, you know how it is. You know how it is. But they had some very good swag in general. They had a Ethereum United jerseys at ECC this year. Shout out Espresso. Great team. All right, so and just in case it's not clear, I can be bribed with swag, so
easily bribed with swag.
Send swag, send swag. It's like really low barrier to getting a mention on this show. All right, so big story of the day. I'm reading from my phone here a little bit, but we got the launch of Unichain, and this was a big announcement. It's been long rumored. Shout out Dan Elitzer for correctly predicting this a couple of years ago. I'll just tee it up with a couple of details, then want to get your take, Michael. So contrary to what I think a lot of people expected, this is not actually an app-specific chain. It is a general-purpose L2. And the idea is probably it's going to be purpose-built and kind of like a DeFi-focused L2, but it's a general-purpose L2 in general. So they partnered up with Flashbots on this, and there's a new roll-up boost product that Flashbots rolled out in tandem with this, and it allows them to build very fast blocks, essentially 250 millisecond flash blocks, where you get you're building this with a TEE, and users get those sorts of guarantees. Additionally, there's something pretty cool. The way that it actually works is you're getting a pre-confirmation,
Right.
and then similar to Solana shreds, basically you're sending all of these things to TEEs. It gets assembled into a big block, similarly to how it works in Solana. And then there's something called the UVN, Uniswap Validator Network, where people can opt in and actually validate those larger blocks, and there are fees that get streamed to the people that opt into doing that. I think it's mostly going to be the foundation and some like the team that starts off with doing it, but then it's eventually going to be permissionless. So
Yeah, and just a couple additional points. There's the amount of staked weight that you have as a validator will be determining how much revenue you would get.
Yep.
And based off of the economic security that you're providing, that's how much you'll be able to get as a validator. And the other element too, and I think this maybe wasn't as clear in the white paper, but it's something that Hayden and Dan confirmed today, is that the way that the blocks will be built is provably fair.
yeah,
And so there won't really even be an opportunity, just given the 250 millisecond block times in general, but also the fact that everything is built provably fair or in a provably fair way, there won't really be any MEV capabilities,
Yeah.
which I think is a unique element.
I do as well. It's super cool. It's a departure from the philosophy of just max extraction and then return to users to just kind of prevent it from being the case. So it's not the type of thing where a builder, assembles a bunch of transactions and then orders them in like priority fees. It's
Right.
just basically all done in the TEE. So it's very cool. I don't actually have the details of that yet. Hasu's coming on the podcast next week, and
There
we're
we
going to
go.
get into the MEV and the roll-up builder aspect of this.
Yeah, so, and I think what they announced is that the testnet is live, or maybe soon to be live, and that mainnet will be sometime by the end of this year. I think one of the other features that they've been promoting with this concept in general is that it is a generalized L2, but it's also specifically built for cross-chain liquidity.
Yes.
And I think being able to get around the bridge or get around any sort of bridging when you're looking for liquidity in swaps is fundamental, and it'll be really interesting to see where does liquidity accrue, how does liquidity actually work when you're trading from L2 to L2 or network to network or L1 to L2, whatever it may be. But I'm curious to see the implementation details on that, because that'll be really interesting as it applies to cross-chain capabilities.
Yeah, me as well. And shout out to a friend of the pod, Hart Lamber of Across, who's been developing that standard with Uniswap. So very interested to see how that works in general.
Yep.
What do you think about this whole move from the Uniswap perspective? There's the Uniswap perspective and how, like, whether or not this makes sense for Uniswap as a protocol. And then there's, people love to FUD ETH these days, and they're like, oh, this is bearish ETH, like that sort of thing because of fees. Why don't we actually start with that angle, and like, what do you think about that?
Well, we're on bell curve pod, so
Yeah,
let's apply the bell
Firmly in
curve.
the middle.
Yeah, I mean, look, the bearish ETH perspective, I think, is firmly in the middle. And with the caveat of short-term versus long-term, yes, there's potentially, I mean, what they have promoted is that the fee cost to use Unichain will be 20x cheaper than using sort of the existing Uniswap product. Obviously, that directly applies to what you're going to be spending in terms of the amount of ETH burn that the Uniswap protocol is burning.
Yeah.
But I think that that's actually just the short-term perspective, and probably not something that persists longer duration. And probably going to front run a lot of the Empire pod, which we recorded on stage earlier today with Avichal from Electric. But basically, the way that we think about this is there's an economic factor, and I can't remember the name of it, where
Deadweight loss.
That's another one.
Okay.
But if you lower the price of something, the volume actually increases.
Yeah.
And it happens in electricity, it happens in oil. It's like if you lower the cost of gas, it turns out people actually travel further. They use more gas. And that
Induced demand?
I think it's something like that. We quick go for a doodle, but
Yeah.
but the same effect will apply here, where if you reduce the cost, you would expect over time that the amount of trading volume will actually farther increase than the amount of decreased cost, just because there's more functionality, there's more capabilities with what you're actually transacting. And so I would expect that actually is the exact same effect that takes over here. Revenue will probably ultimately increase as opposed to decrease based off of reduction in cost, especially if you apply things like the fact that you're going to be able to have cross-chain built in. You're going to be able to have liquidity that's going to be just easily accessible in a 250 millisecond basis.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just not something that exists on chain on Ethereum right now. And so I think it's fundamentally bullish ETH. It may be short-term bearish in terms of the amount of ETH that is being burned, but what that implies also is that you're valuing ETH on a short-term basis based off of a discounted cash flow, which is that is just the epitome of mid-curve from my perspective. And so I think there is an element of, okay, we want to see how much ETH is being burned ultimately. That's a revenue basis for the token. But I think you also want to look at it from a monetary standard, and you want to look at it from a tech platform perspective as well. And the competition that you now enable with a 250 millisecond transaction time for something as fundamental as Uniswap and swapping puts it on par with things that are happening on Solana. It puts it on par with things that are happening in a centralized exchange. Like there's now functionality, or there will be when this launches, for being on par with Coinbase. And that's just something that Uniswap hasn't had before, even though it's been competing, at least in certain points in time in terms of volume. So I think it's fundamentally bullish ETH long term for a multitude of reasons.
I'm 100% in that camp because even if we did a whole bell curve season with Dan Robinson where if you go back and listen to that, he very clearly spelled out what from the Uniswap perspective and just DEX design in general, they were really concerned with mitigating this dead weight loss factor, which is there's some sort of utility curve here or efficiency curve where you're trying to charge as much fees as you can. You're trying to maximize the net amount of fees that you get, right? And if you charge, you can imagine on one end of the curve, if you're charging $1,000 per transaction, you're going to get no transactions, and if you're charging zero, you're going to get a ton, but you're going to make no money. Somewhere along that curve is where you want to be, where you're maximizing the total amount of fees that you generate. And so, the whole fee debate is this Uniswap Unichain is exactly what the plan was, right? Like what we didn't want to do, the huge fees that ETH generated back in 2021, that was great. It wasn't sustainable because the cost, the fees per transaction was extremely high.
Right.
This is just making the fee per transaction much lower, but it should stimulate much more demand.
Right.
The other thing that I think this is again just the plan, right? Like the plan was to move a lot of these transactions up to L2s. There's a blob market for that. This is probably going to saturate the blob market, so it might make transactions a little bit more expensive on L2, but again, to a pretty reasonable level. And you're moving these crazy, price gouging fees off the L1 up to L2s where it's just much more reasonable. I think people are mid-curving it too.
Yeah, what I would expect is you'll probably see a decrease in Uniswap fee burn, on whatever you choose to look at, maybe ultrasound.money, but you'd have a commensurate increase in blob fee burn.
Yeah.
And so I totally agree with that. We were talking about this a little bit ago, but 4844 launched in, I think, March of this year. We've been in the middle of that J curve where you expect kind of like, okay, things change, prices decrease, so therefore it's going to take a little while before blobs can start hitting that max threshold. And that's where you're going to start to see ETH become deflationary again. Frankly, something like this is probably the best opportunity that we have, at least in the short term, to have that blob market max out again. And I wouldn't be surprised if we actually pass through the J curve on the way back once this launches. So I could see this being fundamentally bullish on the short term as well, assuming that we get the requisite amount of volume that I expect we will.
So, all right, that's the sort of ETH perspective. Let's talk about this from the perspective of Unichain in general. It's really cool. I think one of the, just looking at it and having thought about it for a little bit, it's only been live for like a day or something like that. Yep. But, Uniswap has attacked all layers of the stack of DEX. They've got the wallet layer in the front end, so they've got the order flow sort of origination. They've got the liquidity layer of like V3 and soon to be V4. And now, like the last thing to do, kind of was their settlement layer. It looks like they're kind of vertically integrating a little bit here and controlling the entire user experience, which, like, they've got the brand and the distribution to do that. It's probably going to lead to huge UX improvements. Like, I think it's a good move.
Yeah, it's obviously a good move. I think one of the concepts that we talked about on stage, and sorry for front running again,
yeah, front run it, dude. Yeah.
But you'll hear this twice if you listen to both pods. There's this concept called the smiling curve.
Yes.
And this is basically, on the x-axis, it's basically, the value creation, the value chain at each different phase. And you've got basically, everything down to the hard technology, the infrastructure, all the way to the user experience. And that represents a smile because the value accrued at the ends of the spectrum are high, whereas if you get stuck in the middle, you get squeezed, and therefore it's low. And so that's why it's called the smiling curve. That's what it visually looks like. And what I see going on with Uniswap, and remember, Uniswap Labs has built Uniswap the application. That is moving further out on the owning the end user experience perspective. They're going to start competing with Robinhood, with Coinbase, with kind of everyone who owns the user experience, and that's obviously highly valuable. But I see this as, they're not going to be moving as far to the end of the spectrum as they possibly can. That base level will still be Ethereum, and this is kind of the pro ETH perspective, but it moves them further down the stack to where they're going to own more of the user experience, own more of the protocol to be able to affect the user experience. So they're going to be able to write their ticket a lot more than they would have if they were stuck in the middle. And so I don't necessarily see this as they just moved to the end and they're going to have the base level security be based around Unichain. It's still going to be an Optimism, L2. It's still going to be based on Ethereum, but it moves them out of that messy middle section, and they just will be able to accrue more value, not only in this example, but I think also we now have another use for uni tokens themselves.
We do.
And governance is great. I think everybody's always been asking for what's value accrual going to look like. This is one way that they're going to be able to have value accrual for the uni token without having to turn on that fee switch.
Yes, 100%. And I love the smiling curve. I think that was originally used to describe the computing industry back in the 90s, but it's been, it works across a whole bunch of different types of industries. And yeah, I think was it surprising to you that they decided to go instead of an app chain for a more general purpose chain? And I know there's this kind of cycle here. I think John Charbonneau likes to talk about, you start off as an app, and then you want to launch as a general purpose so that you can get more value capture and you can have other apps build. But then all of those apps want actually more sovereignty and customizability.
So then they go,
It's like this,
it's the vicious cycle.
It is, yeah.
It's like, every really good product ultimately wants to become a platform, and then all the products that are built on top of it also want to become the platform.
Yeah.
And so you just get stuck in the XKCD, 15th framework, whatever that example is. It's funny. I think you want to promote the fact that you could be a general purpose L2 because maybe there's going to be people that want to build on top, and this is where I think it'll be interesting to see the devil in the details once they launch. Where if you have access to different cross-chain layers of liquidity, that's going to be fundamentally valuable for maybe user experiences or apps that want to build and not necessarily build with the liquidity, but just want to build on top of that. It kind of remains to be seen, and maybe this is them promoting the fact that they want to have that, and it's aspirational, and we'll see how it works eventually. But I could see a path where other apps are built on top of Unichain too.
You know what it reminds me of a little bit? We had Eugene from Ellipsis on the podcast talking about Atlas. It reminds me of that a little bit, where it's a purpose-built DeFi L2, and they're an SVM L2, and they have these pretty cool specs like prioritizing Oracle updates and things like that. So there's a little bit of a tension in between something that's permissionless and also an app-specific platform, right? Because anyone can build anything. But if you make it purpose-built, the idea is that DeFi-specific applications will want to build here versus somewhere else. And it seems like a similar idea with now Unichain.
Yeah, Hyperliquid is another example,
Yeah.
Where eventually they're going to have their own chain. It's going to be general purpose. People can build on top of it. I mean, this example has existed in many different industries. I mean, even thinking back to like Amazon, they had Amazon, the application built on top of AWS, the technology, and then eventually they're like, wait a second, we can just sell this AWS product and make way more money doing that. It's like, okay, that's pretty neat. I think that model works. It's harder to pull off than just having your own application. My personal experience working at Dropbox is we tried to build a platform, didn't work, and ultimately went back to just being an application, and that's pretty much okay. But sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and so I think you kind of have to pick and choose your levels of competition and where you want to compete. Because if you don't choose where you're going to compete, then you're going to compete everywhere, and that is ultimately a failure state.
Here's another interesting comparison as well between Atlas and Unichain is that now you're getting infrastructure that's getting built out by app devs first, right? Because Atlas, the Ellipsis built Phoenix, the DEX on Solana, and they kind of took those lessons learned and those competencies to actually build, purpose-built infrastructure. And it's just interesting to see because there's always been this chicken and the egg problem in crypto and other industries with apps and infrastructure. And the infra is supposed to support the apps, but you need the infra before you can get the app. So how do you know? And now it seems like there's this new generation of app builders who are like, all right, I've built an application. I don't have the info that I want yet, so I'm just going to build it myself.
I mean, one of the questions I asked is, what if instead of having Uniswap, V1, V2, V3, and they just went out with Unichain as the first product, and it's not really, it wasn't feasible for them to do that back then, and so they had to, take the path that they did. But what if they built Unichain first?
Yeah.
And would you consider that to be an application, or would that be infrastructure? I think that there's an element here where we're going to start to see sort of the blending of that definition a little bit, where applications who, there's like this famous, I think it was Arthur C. Clarke that said this, it's like people who are really serious about software build their own hardware. And I think that we're going to start to see some of that, where you don't want to have to rely on somebody else to control everything on the back end. If you want to build the best experience, which ultimately you want to do as a product builder, you have to own the full stack, or more of the stack than you have been historically.
That's a really good point. And Amazon's probably a really good example of that. Like, is Amazon an application or are they infrastructure? It's like kind of both, right? Like they started with the application and they built their own infrastructure. Now they make more profit, at least, from AWS than the original sort of sales business. So, hey everyone, this episode is brought to you by Supra, the new blazing fast vertically integrated L1, which helps you scale your dApp. If you are a builder, you're probably dealing with some combination of cost, complexity, and fragmentation of existing solutions. So if you're building over an ETH L2 land, everything's feeling a little bit fragmented at the moment. And if you're building in Solana, everything is fast and on one layer, but maybe you're limited in terms of what you can do with your AppSpace. So Supra is rolling out a new product called Supra Containers. So you can head over to supra.com/containers. To learn more. They offer dedicated customizable app spaces running on Supra's 500,000 TPS Layer 1 blockchain. That gives you complete control over gas tokens and fees. So some cool things you can do, you get the freedom you can use your own token, create local fee markets, or even go gasless, whatever you want. So this product isn't live yet, but because you are a faithful listener of Bell Curve, you get notified first. So head over to supra.com/containers. Thank me later. Hey everyone, this episode is brought to you by Index Co-op and their new product, the Leverage Suite, which I highly recommend that you check out. Click the link in the bottom of the show notes. Now, disclaimer, whenever it comes to leverage, do your own research. This is not financial advice, all of that good stuff. Don't bet more than you can lose. But if you are going to lever up, you might as well not pay an arm and a leg and save a ton of money and use Index Co-op's Leverage Suite. So the way that they actually achieve these savings is pretty cool. They leverage the power of money Legos, DeFi, in this case, Uniswap and Aave. So the cost of carry for this trade is actually based on the funding rate of Aave as opposed to perp dexes, which tend to be much more variable and higher overall. Additionally, perp dexes will also charge you usually based on the entire open interest, so the leverage exposure that you have as opposed to just the amount of money that you put in, which is what Index Co-op is doing here. And the result of what you get is just an ERC20, which gives you something like 2x ETH. So if you want to lever up and you want to save money doing it, I highly recommend that you go check out the Index Co-op Leverage Suite. Very, very cool. Thank you very much, Index Co-op, for making this episode possible. Okay, one other take before we move on here, or observation I want to get your take on, is that this was all kind of announced, and this was done, spearheaded through the Labs entity. And I saw a couple takes on Twitter like, hey, was the DAO consulted about this? Did they even know that this was happening?
I didn't actually know that, yeah.
And, it's kind of, I understand that there are lines, and Uniswap has a little bit of a unique structure, but it does kind of feel like, well, this is a huge change to Uniswap, the protocol here, and at the very least, like, why do we really have governance here if the Labs entity can just do this? So what do you think about that?
I mean, I didn't even think about that, or it didn't click when I read it. Unfortunately, I think that this is just the state of the regulatory environment that we're in.
Yeah.
And I think it would be great if we could have all of clear paths and clear separation of concerns in terms of who is able to do what, how we're governing both entities. But just in the same example of the smiling curve and having them move to both ends, that's like equity company on the one end and token protocol on the other end.
Yeah.
And so I think Uniswap is probably the one so far that I've seen who's been able to hopefully successfully do both.
Yeah.
Typically, you need to have your choice of, okay, we're an equity company, or, okay, we're going to be a decentralized protocol.
Yeah.
Very few examples exist, if any, other than Uniswap, where you've done both. And I think this is probably just they have, hands tied behind their backs where they can't necessarily, effectuate certain decisions, or the foundation has been hamstrung based off of, closed door conversations or agreements, whatever.
Yeah.
And I don't know anything. This is not speculation. It just feels like it. I know that they've been through the ringer in terms of regulations, and so I would imagine that plays a part.
Right. Well, and there's always a discussion around the fee switch, and there have been a couple proposals which look like they actually have some weight behind them, and then they end up not passing at the last minute. And I have to imagine it's the regulatory stuff. So speaking of that, the odds on Polymarket have shifted quite a bit within the last week.
Yep.
I think they're basically neck and neck with Kamala leading, I think, a little bit. And now Trump is in the lead by, at one point yesterday I was checking.
56-43.
56-43, yeah, 13 percentage points. I mean, that's pretty crazy. Do you know what's driving that? I haven't.
I think what has happened, it's interesting, like, as someone who has moonlighted as a data analyst for this election cycle.
You're actually pretty in the weeds.
Yeah, no.
You advanced know your stuff.
Yeah, well, we've just followed a lot of the pollsters, and I don't know. It's nice to have something that's like not directly crypto, where you can like plug in some brain cycles and like it relates, but it's not exactly, and it's just like interesting.
Yeah.
And it only happens every 4 years, so it's like might as well spend the time thinking
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah.
But what we have seen at least is a series of polls, especially in the swing states, that have just not been favorable for her.
Yeah.
And it looks like she's losing ground. There's been rumors that have been verified by places like Politico that they're internally they're nervous based off of what they're seeing. And the way that it works is you have all of these external polls, and most of them are partnerships between like a news organization and a polling company. But then you also have these polling companies that work for the campaigns.
Yeah.
And so they're doing internal polling. They just don't release that.
Huh.
And they usually, I mean, you can imagine how this works. There's definitely a bias in 2012 with Mitt Romney.
Sure.
He thought he was going to win, ended up losing.
Yeah.
There's definitely some bias, but what you're starting to see is some of the external polling turn negative. And just, I think yesterday, or maybe it was the day before, the Trump campaign actually released their internal polling for the swing states.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is the catalyst. Part of it is also what's going on in the external polling. But what I think is a fair apples to apples comparison is when you're looking at polling data, you have to look at it in relation to previous election cycles.
Yeah.
And right now, at least in the service that we use that's the best is Real Clear Politics. And what they kind of innovated was, we're going to take all the best pollsters and we're going to know who the best pollsters are, but we're going to take an average, a running average over the last maybe 15 polls for each different category. So maybe it's national head-to-head, national five-way, and then each swing state. And so Real Clear Politics is probably the best source of truth that we have for where are the polling numbers going, and you kind of have to look at it from a trend perspective, but then, like I said, you have to look at it in comparison to last cycle. And right now, the head-to-head has, I think, Kamala Harris up 1.8% in national polls on average, but where that compares is, I think it was 8.1% for Biden, and then I think it was 5.6% on the same day, basically October 11th in 2020 and then in 2016. And so she's still 3 points behind where Clinton was in 2016. And obviously we know that he won that election. And so I think what we're starting to see is what you have to assume if there is a hope for things to change is that the polling has fundamentally changed in the last two election cycles. And it's a hard assumption to make just because the way that people collect polling data is by phone calls and text messages, and like the process hasn't fundamentally changed that much. Maybe there's less kind of like shy Trump voters this election cycle. Maybe there's more. I think it's going to be really interesting to see the bias ultimately from where the polls were and what the final election tally is. But yeah, the way that we think about it is the comparison between 16 and 20, and she's behind by a lot.
I'm interested in that as well, whether or not there are more shy Trump voters this time. Initially, around the time of his assassination attempt, I thought no, but now I'm leaning a little bit more. I think there probably still is. And
I mean, the whole election cycle has changed since then because it's a new candidate. It's all of the things. But
it's pretty crazy how fast the news cycle is and how much we've moved on. I mean, that feels like forever ago, and that was only a couple months ago.
Totally.
And the other thing too about Polymarket, I think Paul Graham is right, the YC guy.
Yep.
You know, I saw him tweeting out. A lot of people have been tweeting out that Polymarket is being gamed, and you know, Paul Graham tweeted something out about, you know, Polymarket is being gamed, and it's, you know, Polymarket is showing something very divergent from what polls are showing. Maybe there's an arbitrage. You know, I don't mean to dunk on Paul Graham. He's a smart guy. He's made a ton of money and everything. That's not how arbitrage works. You know, you can't arb a market against polls. That doesn't make any sense. But also, I hate this take that Polymarket is rigged in some way. I mean, you know, it's flipped now in between Kamala Harris and Trump a bunch of times, and every single time one of the candidates takes the lead, that other side just says, someone's pushing this market around or manipulating it. You know, it's been a really close election, and I don't know. I just don't really buy that take.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be the other really interesting point as you start to see the averages of these polls come through, and then put that data up against the Polymarket trends, and then put that final data with the final tally, and see ultimately who was the most right. I mean, wisdom of the crowds would suggest Polymarket definitely has an edge. The way I also think about it is there's basically three prediction markets. There's Polymarket, there's Predictit, and now there's Kalshi.
Yep.
And I
think Kalshi's been around for a while. They've been chugging. They've been really trying to do it the right way. Right?
Correct. But I think it was the last 2 weeks or maybe the last week where they had an official okay from the CFTC.
Okay.
They have been around for a while, and Predictit has also been around for a while, but it's extremely limited in terms of who can get access to it.
Way lower volume.
Way lower volume, and so I kind of don't really count Predictit in there, but Kalshi also has Trump favored, I think, 2%. Obviously, Polymarket is way higher. It's much more liquid, and so it'll be interesting. I have also heard, anecdotally, I think I shared this last week, that there are a number of large buyers of Kamala tokens on Polymarket just as a pure hedge.
A hedge.
Expecting that Trump would be more favorable to crypto. I think we can debate that. But ultimately, I think people are looking at it as a hedge, and maybe that hedge is over at this point, and people are just kind of running with it. But it'll be interesting given the Keynesian beauty contest construct of prediction markets. It isn't what I think will happen. It's what I think most other people will think will happen. And that's how you need to evaluate it. And so it is an interesting second order effect of how these prediction markets function, where it's not just pure, I think Trump should win or I think Kamala Harris should win. It's how I think the rest of the population will vote.
Right. Let's talk about how it has come up a number of times, actually, at Permissionless so far this week, how a Trump victory versus a Harris victory might impact crypto. And people are trying to slice and dice as well, just overall good and bad, you know, from a price appreciation standpoint, from an ability to operate in the U.S. standpoint. But also, you know, we've talked about this before a little bit. There's so much consensus that if Trump wins, it's just gonna, everything's up and to the right, which might happen, but usually consensus isn't always 100% right. And there was Quinn Thompson, one of the hosts of Forward Guidance now, had an interesting thought that, you know, I just hadn't thought about this, and I'm not sure what I still think about it. But yeah, actually, because right now I would say the consensus view is that if Trump wins, it's very good for alts, like probably ETH and Solana, and you know,
sell Bitcoin, buy alts.
Right. But he actually made a point that it could go the other way, which would be interesting because if you imagine a world where, okay, let's just all of these regulatory constraints that we've had in the U.S. as operating as a protocol, all right, get rid of them. Right? You just operate as a protocol. You can return revenue to token holders if you want. You can do token value accrual. Everyone's like, great, this is awesome. And then you start looking at the metrics, and you're like, whoa, this looks expensive. You know, like none of these alts look priced correctly. You know, so you could, I don't know what you think about that little pet theory.
It's an interesting perspective. I think, fortunately for us, we operate with a venture scale perspective.
Yeah.
We're not going to be making trades based off of election results.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's actually kind of interesting in talking with a bunch of our LPs and partners. It's like their perspective right now is that it's a no trade zone.
Yeah.
And it has been basically for the last 30 days. And it's like, it's not waiting to see who wins. Yeah. It's just waiting to see this thing over, to be able to move past this uncertainty and then know where to operate from. And and so I think what will happen is ultimately, no matter who wins, it's going to be fundamentally bullish because there's a removal of uncertainty. And I mean, the other perspective here, which I've been hearing a couple of times now, which I agree with, is like when I played football, you'd watch tape afterwards, and coaches would always say, like, it never looks as good or it never looks as bad on tape as you thought it in live in person. And if you make a great play, it's like, oh, it looks kind of stupid. Or if like you got blown up, you're like, oh, it actually wasn't that bad.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be something similar here where, like, if Trump gets elected, it's not going to be as good as people expect, because people think it's going to rocket, Bitcoin is going to rocket to 100K the next day. Like, that's probably not going to happen. Maybe it does, but then we're in risk of, like, blowing off the top.
Totally.
And I think it's not going to be as bad if she gets elected, because there are structural things that will need to change. I think, things like Gary Gensler, and we can get into this too, but, like, it looks more and more the case that the Senate will flip, and fundamentally the Senate and the House are constructive on crypto, and I don't think that there will be some sort of regulatory change. It'll just take longer, and that's actually a good thing.
Yeah.
And so the other perspective that I have is, like, the thing that we don't want is the blow off the top effect, basically like we had in Q1 with the ETF.
In March. Yeah.
February, every single day was positive.
Yeah.
Like, that chart is insane.
Yeah, it is.
And it probably pulled a lot of potential from the rest of the year. And, that's where we're sitting right now. So I would say it's probably not going to be as good or as bad as people expect. There will probably be some emotional trading around the election, but I think it's going to be positive going into 25 no matter what. It's just going to, it depends on how fast, basically.
I agree with that, and I think that wait-and-see approach has explained why crypto has traded a little bit funny. I mean, even if you look at the S&P 500, it's just been a straight line up this year, and crypto is very correlated to the NASDAQ now, and we're entering, finally, we've talked about it on the show a million times, a global rate-cutting cycle and an easing cycle.
People forget about that.
Yeah, people forget about that. We got 50 bips over here, in the last FOMC, but in China, they cut their reserve requirement by 50 basis points. They made it much easier to get a mortgage to prop up their housing market. They also took this crazy, pretty unprecedented step where they let certain institutional investors actually borrow from the government to buy stocks.
Yeah.
Think about that. That's nuts. Imagine if we heard that over here. Fed was like, hey, guys, you can use your treasuries as collateral. Take them, go sell it, buy stocks.
Yeah.
You'd be like, buy everything
At
with
the
both
Fed
hands,
funds window.
right? Yeah. So, I mean, I think that it's easy to forget about that.
Yeah.
And I think once this huge uncertainty gets removed, it's going to be pretty positive no matter what.
Yeah. And structurally, too, I think, there's a lot of really positive momentum on the regulatory side, and it's just a lot of people are waiting. There's not going to be any interest in putting things forward by the end of the year. Maybe something gets put forward just as a proof positive for what the next Congress will do, but starting in January, it's game on from a legislative perspective.
Yeah. All right. I got to get your perspective on the Satoshi unveil.
Oh my God!
Yeah, I'm looking at the details here right now, but he got he got named as Peter Todd, who is, in a lot of ways, I guess, fits the profile of someone who could be Satoshi, but well, I don't want to editorialize it too much, but a lot of this was based on a very quick comment that Peter Todd made in the very early days, which the documentarian he concluded that it was Peter Todd accidentally posted from the wrong account and then went to change it. There was one other thing too that I'm blanking on, but yeah. What do you think?
I don't think it's Peter Todd.
I don't either. No, I don't think it is.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't see the full thing. I just saw the clip of them kind of revealing to him in the video that they think it's him.
Yeah.
And his reaction, I think, is kind of perfect in that he's just like, that's so funny.
Yeah.
And all the Bitcoiners are going to love this because they know it's not me. And they're just going to be like, oh, look at this journalist trying to, point the finger at a new person. And guess what? It's not me. And everyone's going to know it. And so joke's on you.
Yep.
And it's just like, yeah, that's exactly the reaction that you would expect from someone who's not actually Satoshi.
So do you think that it would matter if they found someone who everyone was like, oh yeah, this probably is Satoshi, and he or she or they or whatever was still alive? Do you think it would matter?
Well, I don't know if this is real or not. One of the other people, well, this part is real, but Len Swanson?
Sassman?
Sassman, yeah. He, on Polymarket, of course there was a Polymarket for this,
Yeah.
was at least trending up and going into the launch of the video. And it's, I mean, there's a lot of lore around this, but unfortunately he committed suicide in 2012 or 2011. And so he's no longer here, but apparently there was some note that was left behind, and like there's some cryptic something in there. And so I think the only thing that actually matters to get to the point is what happens to the $1 million Bitcoin wallet that is sitting out there that nobody supposedly has access to.
Yeah.
And so structurally, that's the only thing that really matters. If it, I actually think it's probably a combination of a few people. And I don't have any, strong evidence one way or another as to who those people are, but it's probably not just one person.
Yeah.
And so I think it's probably, maybe someone who's still alive today, maybe someone who's not. Like other people that we've talked about or that have been talked about is Hal Finney.
Yeah, he's the one that everyone always thinks
exactly.
of,
So he passed away from ALS, I think, in 2011 as well.
Sad.
But ultimately, it doesn't really matter who the person is because it is what it is at this point. I think what does structurally matter is who has access to that million token wallet.
Yeah. How much is it? It's 1.1 million Bitcoin, right?
I think so.
Yeah, that's quite a bit.
It's like 5% of all Bitcoin.
You know what's funny? I remember reading when Coinbase filed to go public, they have to list their risks.
All the risks?
Yeah, they actually included that as a risk.
Oh, yeah.
Because it is, right? That would be challenging for markets if those coins started to move. Like, I could see the whole market selling off 20% in one day.
I mean, look, just today, I think Mt. Gox this morning said that they're not going to be distributing the Mt. Gox portion until, or part of it until October 31st, 2025. I think that announcement is what drove Bitcoin price like 2.5% today.
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, if that like 50,000 Bitcoins can drive it that much, what could the rest of it do?
Well, hopefully it's not linear from that. That would be a big. That would be a very big swing. But
look, I mean, they're going to be top taking the market October 31st, 2025.
They are, yeah, actually, for sure. If the algo plays out, but I think that was basically all the stories that we had this week. But dude, it's good to see you in real life.
I know. Always fun to be here. This is the best event.
Oh, thanks, man. I appreciate it. Yeah. We'll have to get Vance. We'll get him in the next one. Yeah.
Get some R&R and come back next week.
Our boy, and we'll see whose predictions ended up right on this Kane and David fight.
Yeah, that's gonna be interesting.
They're live streaming it on Bankless's YouTube as well.
Know,
so
I know.
All right, yeah, we'll be there in person. So
Yep.
All right, cool. All right, buddy.
See ya.
Good one.
All right.